Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, help me out by leaving a like and consider subscribing. Now, on to today's stories. Today we start off with the Freeway Phantom, Washington, D.C. area, 1971 to 1972. We turn our attention now to the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area during the early 1970s, a time when the nation's capital was gripped by an unseen terror operating along its major roadways. Our focus is on a series of unsolved murders that targeted young black girls, whose bodies were discovered near busy commuter routes. This predator would become known as the Freeway Phantom. The spree began in the fall of 1971. The first known victim was Carol Spinks, age 13. She vanished on April 25, 1971, in southeast D.C. It wasn't until 6 days later that her body was discovered off the shoulder of Interstate 295, a major commuter artery. The circumstances were chilling. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The discovery sent initial alarm through the immediate community, but the wider city did not yet grasp the magnitude of the danger. That awareness came quickly with the second victim. On July 8, 1971, Darlenia Johnson, age 16, disappeared. Her body was found 10 days later, again near I-295. She had been strangled. The proximity to the freeway, the similarity in the victim's demographics, and a shared method of death signaled that a single, methodical predator was operating in the region. The pattern solidified into profound fear with the third victim, Brenda Woodard, aged 18. Brenda vanished on September 10, 1971. Her body was discovered 3 days later off the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, which connects D.C. to Baltimore. The choice of the BW Parkway indicated that the killer was mobile and utilizing the expansive freeway system to select and discard his victims. The investigation was immediately plagued by systemic difficulties. Because the victims were primarily young black girls from marginalized sections of D.C., the cases received significantly less media and law enforcement attention than they warranted, leading to understandable frustration and distrust within the affected communities. This slow initial response allowed the killer to continue operating in the shadows of the commuter traffic. The victims began to be discovered with increasingly chilling details. Ninema Hodge, age 19, was found on November 20, 1971, also near the BW Parkway. Investigators noted that the killer was taking significant risks by leaving the bodies in areas visible from the roads, but was doing so quickly and efficiently, perhaps relying on the speed and anonymity of freeway traffic. The most unsettling aspect of the Freeway Phantom's method was the direct communication he began to establish with the police or through the press. When Brenda Faye Crockett, age 10, was found on February 5, 1972, she was discovered with a handwritten note. The note contained a disturbing taunt directed at the police, mocking their inability to find him. This act of leaving a message elevated the profile of the killer. It suggested an organized, intelligent predator who was not only able to evade capture, but felt confident enough to play games with the authorities. The notes added a layer of psychological warfare to the physical terror. The final known victim in the recognized series was Diane Williams, age 17, found on September 5, 1972, near the Washington-Baltimore Parkway in Prince George's County, Maryland. Like the others, she had been strangled. The entire spree lasted approximately 18 months and claimed the lives of 6 young girls. All were found either off I-295 or the BW Parkway. The case earned its enduring nickname, the Freeway Phantom, because the killer utilized the vast, complex network of major roads as both his hunting ground and his means of escape. The investigation was colossal for the time, involving the D.C. Metropolitan Police and multiple jurisdictions in Maryland. However, a lack of interagency coordination, difficulties in evidence sharing, and the initial lack of comprehensive DNA technology allowed the trail to go cold. Despite years of searching, the taunting notes and the location of the bodies remained the most significant, yet ultimately fruitless, clues. The case remained cold for decades. In 2009, Renewed interest led to the application of modern forensic techniques. A few years later, in 2012, authorities announced a significant breakthrough. DNA evidence collected from the clothing of one of the victims was matched to a convicted murderer who had been in the D.C. area during the time of the attacks. However, despite this DNA link and the naming of a suspect, the case has not resulted in a conviction. The suspect was never formally charged for the Freeway Phantom murders, and the complexity of the surviving evidence has left the official investigation unable to fully close the chapter on the 6 girls. The legacy of the Freeway Phantom is not just the tragedy of the victims, but the historical context of the city in fear and the systemic challenges that allowed a serial killer to operate along its most visible corridors without being caught. The questions of the 1970s still linger along the shoulders of the DC freeways. Next story, The Eastbound Strangler, Atlantic City, New Jersey, 2006 to 2007. We move now to the Jersey Shore, to the familiar coastline of Atlantic City, New Jersey, in the mid-2000s. Our focus is not on the bright lights of the boardwalk or the casinos, but on the quiet, marshy edges of the city where the fear began to gather. This is the story of the Eastbound Strangler, a predator who targeted women near a quiet access road leading away from the resort town. The fear began to materialize in November 2006. On November 20th, 2006, the body of a woman was found by 2 hunters in a drainage ditch behind a small motel in Egg Harbor Township, a quiet area just outside of Atlantic City proper. This location was near the former site of the Black Horse Pike, a major route connecting the inland areas to the coast. The circumstances of the discovery were immediately unsettling. The victim, who was later identified as Kim Raffo, age 35, had been strangled. She was found nude, facing east toward the Atlantic Ocean, and her head was covered by a white bag. This initial discovery sent a quiet shock through local law enforcement, but the true scope of the danger was yet to be realized. The area behind the motel was swampy and overgrown, suggesting the killer chose a place that provided cover, yet was still accessible by car. Less than a month later, on December 13, 2006, police returned to the same area behind the motel. As they searched the vast, wet terrain, they made a horrific discovery. 3 more bodies, all female, all bearing similar characteristics to the first victim. The discovery immediately confirmed the presence of a serial killer. The 4 victims were found roughly 450 feet apart, lying in the same fashion, nude, facing east, and all had been strangled. They were identified as Molly Diltz, 20, Barbara Brader, 42, and Jacqueline Glass, 48. The location was particularly significant. The bodies were aligned along a small drainage ravine that ran parallel to the road. This highly organized staging, the shared cause of death, and the geographic concentration led investigators to immediately link the 4 murders. The name Eastbound Strangler was quickly adopted by the media, referring to the victim's peculiar orientation toward the ocean. The investigation became a massive undertaking, involving local police, the New Jersey State Police, and the FBI. Their primary challenge was the environment and the victims' lifestyles. The women were known to have worked in the sex trade in the Atlantic City area, a factor that complicated the gathering of witness information and DNA evidence. The lack of immediate witness information and the challenging terrain meant that the key to solving the case would be meticulous forensic work. Investigators focused on finding microscopic evidence that the killer might have left behind in the secluded, marshy area. The killer was quickly profiled as someone methodical and highly organized, likely a local resident or someone with routine access to the area, given the precise knowledge required to repeatedly access the hidden ditch. The careful staging of the victims suggested a psychological need to exert control or send a deliberate message. The case terrified the region. Despite the lack of an immediate arrest, the pressure on the sex trade community led many women to leave Atlantic City, demonstrating the chilling power of the unknown killer to change the dynamics of the city's vulnerable population. Investigators worked thousands of leads, interviewing residents, checking motel records and running DNA profiles through national databases. They pursued a number of strong leads, including truck drivers, motel workers, and other individuals with ties to the area, but none provided the conclusive link needed for an arrest. The initial shock of the quadruple murder began to fade into a frustrating cold case as the months turned into years. The authorities repeatedly assured the public that the investigation was active, but the killer had seemingly vanished, leaving behind only the profound silence of the marsh and the unanswered questions surrounding the 4 victims. The case of the eastbound strangler remains unsolved today. Despite the clear physical evidence, the concentration of the victims, and the compelling staging details, the identity of the killer has eluded police for nearly 2 decades. The murders serve as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can take root on the fringes of even the busiest and most famous resort towns, where the ocean washes against the desolate quiet of the salt marshes. Next story, The Valley Killer, New Hampshire/Vermont, 1980s. We now travel to the quiet, picturesque landscape of the Upper Valley region, spanning the border between New Hampshire and Vermont along the Connecticut River. This area, known for its small college towns, covered bridges, and peaceful forests, was the scene of a series of chilling crimes in the 1980s that would take decades to solve. This is the story of the Valley Killer, a predator whose reign of terror was ultimately broken by the persistence of modern forensic science. The fear began in the summer of 1985. On June 25, 1985, Virginia Ginny Lee Hannon, a 19-year-old resident of the small town of White River Junction, Vermont, was reported missing. She was later found deceased in a wooded area in nearby Hartford, Vermont. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled. The quiet community was shocked, interpreting the crime as a random, isolated act of extreme violence. Just 2 months later, the fear intensified when a second victim, Eva Marie Morse, age 27, was also reported missing from the same area. Her body was discovered in a secluded area of woods in Norwich, Vermont. Like Ginny Hannon, she had been assaulted and strangled, confirming the horrifying truth. A serial predator was operating in the seemingly idyllic Upper Valley. The local and state police forces in both Vermont and New Hampshire were overwhelmed by the crimes. They realized that the killer was likely crossing the state line frequently, using the river and the quiet, winding roads as cover. The killer was dubbed the Valley Killer by law enforcement and the media. Investigators immediately faced challenges. The areas where the victims were found were remote and lacked witnesses. The victims themselves had different backgrounds, making it difficult to establish a single, clear motive or target profile beyond vulnerability. The technology available in the mid-1980s was simply not advanced enough to track the microscopic evidence left behind. The panic in the Upper Valley grew profound. College students, locals, and tourists were cautioned to avoid walking alone. The deep trust that characterized life in these quiet New England towns was suddenly replaced by deep-seated suspicion. The Valley Killer struck again in the summer of 1986. Mary Elizabeth Liz Critchley, age 41, was murdered in early August near Lebanon, New Hampshire, just across the river from the previous 2 attacks. Her body was found in the woods off a quiet road. Her death followed the same chilling pattern: assault and strangulation. The consistency of the crime, the method, and the geography proved beyond doubt that a single individual was responsible for the 3 homicides in 3 successive summers. The police investigation focused heavily on local men with known behavioral issues, but without a definitive piece of forensic evidence, the case grew cold. The quiet of the valley returned, but the chilling memory of the 3 victims remained. For decades, the case file remained open, with periodic reviews. The breakthrough that would finally solve the mystery came not through new witness testimony, but through the patient advance of forensic science, specifically mitochondrial DNA analysis. In the early 2000s, investigators from the Vermont State Police and the New Hampshire State Police began working together to re-examine the physical evidence recovered from all 3 crime scenes. The focus was on extracting viable DNA profiles from the clothing and limited physical evidence that had been meticulously preserved for over 20 years. This painstaking work yielded a partial DNA profile. The profile was entered into the National Codes database, but yielded no immediate match. It was a fragment of the truth, waiting for its corresponding half. The final, conclusive step came in 2018, using the revolutionary technique of forensic genetic genealogy. Detectives from Vermont and New Hampshire quietly began working with genetic genealogists, using the killer's unknown DNA profile to build a family tree based on publicly available consumer genealogy databases. This slow, complex process allowed investigators to narrow the suspect pool from millions down to a single family tree. Eventually, this led them to a specific individual who had been living in the Upper Valley area during the time of the murders, Lonnie Hinton. Hinton, who had been a local resident and had worked in the area in the 1980s, had never been a primary suspect in the original investigation. He had died in 2010. Authorities obtained a post-mortem DNA sample from Hinton and achieved a definitive match to the evidence found on all three victims, Ginny Hannon, Eva Marie Morse, and Liz Critchley. The identification of Lonnie Hinton brought an official closure to the case of the Valley Killer after more than 30 years. It was a powerful testament to the persistence of law enforcement and the transformative power of modern science. The case serves as an important example of how secrets hidden in the rural isolation of New England can finally be brought to light, bringing a measure of peace to the victims' families who had endured decades of unanswered questions. Next story, the Honolulu Strangler, Honolulu, Hawaii, 1985. We journey to the island of Oahu and the city of Honolulu in the mid-1980s. Honolulu is defined by the stark contrast of a bustling urban environment set against the calm blue of the Pacific Ocean. It was a time of bright colors, warm trade winds, and a general feeling of security. The sort of methodical, chilling predator often found on the mainland seemed alien to the islands. In 1985, Honolulu was about to learn that darkness can conceal itself just as easily under the tropical sun as it does under the deepest snow. The community would soon be gripped by a fear that felt deeply contradictory to the paradise they called home, the terror of the Honolulu Strangler. The series of events began with the disappearance of 25-year-old Vicki Lee Purdy, a civilian worker for the Navy. On the evening of May 29th, she was last seen waiting for a bus near the Pearl Harbor Gate. She vanished completely. A week later, her body was discovered in a secluded, overgrown area near the Kehi Lagoon, a quiet body of water near the airport. It was an unsettling discovery, but initially, it was investigated as an isolated, tragic incident. However, the nature of the crime, she had been bound and strangled, raised immediate concern among veteran police officers. The meticulous, controlled nature of the violence suggested planning and calculation, rather than a spontaneous, violent outburst. The case was still actively being investigated when, just 1 month later, the pattern repeated itself. In June, 30-year-old Regina Sakamoto, of Japanese heritage, vanished after leaving a nightclub in Waikiki. Like Vicki Purdy, she was later found in a remote, marshy area near the lagoon. She, too, had been bound and strangled. With the discovery of the second victim, the isolated tragedy became a terrifying pattern. The city realized they were dealing with a serial killer. The target profile was forming: young women, often of Asian descent, who were walking alone or waiting for public transportation. The panic grew in July when Denise Hughes, a 21-year-old woman, also vanished after leaving a nightclub. Her car was found abandoned. Her body was later discovered in a similar manner to the first two victims, reinforcing the horrifying consistency of the predator. The contrast was stark. By day, tourists arrived, planes landed, and the beaches were filled with laughter. But as the sun dipped into the Pacific, a palpable fear would descend upon the local women. Women stopped walking alone. Bus stops became places of anxious waiting. A place known for its openness was suddenly cloaked in suspicion. The realization that an unknown predator was operating across the island triggered a massive response. The Honolulu Police Department formed a joint task force with the FBI. They worked around the clock, trying to build a psychological profile of the killer. The profile suggested an organized, disciplined individual who knew the local area well and who likely appeared unassuming in his daily life. He was a master of misdirection, using the island's vastness and the constant flow of people to hide in plain sight. The authorities warned the public, and the news coverage was relentless. Yet, despite the widespread vigilance, the killer was not deterred. On August 27th, 16-year-old Louise Medeiros disappeared. She was last seen at a local market. Like the others, she was discovered near the lagoon. The frequency of the murders, for in 4 months, suggested a killer who was escalating, growing more confident, even in the face of a massive police effort. The city was gripped by a level of fear rarely seen on the islands. Women stayed home, group travel became mandatory, and the nightlife suffered as people feared the walk from the bus stop or the club to their doors. The killer was an anonymous presence, a chilling force working against the very nature of Hawaii, which is built on community and trust. Every stranger was viewed with suspicion. Then there was silence. After the murder of Louise Medeiros, the attacks abruptly stopped. Investigators theorized the killer had either been detained for an unrelated crime, had moved, or had been frightened away by the intense scrutiny. But the case was far from over. The investigation continued for months, focusing heavily on potential suspects who fit the psychological profile. Men with access to transportation, knowledge of the remote areas near the lagoon, and a documented history of minor offenses. Years passed. The task force eventually disbanded. The fear faded into an uneasy memory, and the case of the Honolulu Strangler entered the realm of cold cases, a haunting puzzle that sat uneasily beneath the bright sun of paradise. In the 1990s, the case saw a major breakthrough when DNA technology was applied to the surviving evidence. This forensic work eventually pointed to a suspect, a man who had lived and worked in Honolulu at the time of the murders. However, the legal proceedings that followed were deeply complex. The suspect was arrested, but the trial faced major hurdles regarding the preservation of evidence and testimony. Ultimately, the charges were dropped due to difficulties in proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt, leaving the case unresolved in the eyes of the law. The case of the Honolulu Strangler remains a dark stain on the history of Hawaii. It is a powerful reminder that even in the most beautiful and seemingly secure places, an invisible darkness can take hold. Next story: the disappearance of Ray Rivera, Baltimore, Maryland, 2006. We move now to the vibrant, historic city of Baltimore, Maryland, and the perplexing case of Ray Rivera, a case defined by a strange vanishing act and an ending that defied rational explanation. Our focus is the early summer of 2006 and the unsettling events surrounding the historic Belvedere Hotel. Ray Rivera was a 32-year-old aspiring filmmaker and financial writer living in Baltimore with his wife, Allison. He was known to be bright, imaginative, and deeply loved by his family and friends. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Ray had reportedly been acting unusually stressed and possibly paranoid, though the precise cause of his distress remains unclear. On the evening of May 16, 2006, Ray was at home when he received a phone call. The source of this call was never definitively identified, but it was reportedly from his workplace at the time, Stansberry and Associates Investment Research. Ray was said to have answered the call, and without saying goodbye, he immediately rushed out of the house. He left his glasses and cell phone behind, a detail later noted as highly unusual for him. Ray's wife, Allison, was traveling at the time. When she returned, she found that her husband had vanished, leaving behind no note and no clear destination. The search began immediately, but weeks passed without any trace of Ray. The primary puzzle piece in this case is a bizarre and lengthy note Ray left taped to his computer monitor. The note was rambling and written in the style of a manifesto, referencing people he knew, films he admired, and containing long, disjointed lists of names, including figures from the history of Freemasonry and filmmaking. Crucially, The note ended with a request that the search for him should not be stopped, adding a chilling ambiguity to its content. Authorities initially theorized that the note indicated a potential mental break or suicidal intent. However, family and friends insisted that while the note was strange, it did not reflect Ray's true state of mind, and the content felt more like a coded message or a script outline. On May 24th, 2006, 8 days after Ray disappeared, a crucial discovery was made. His abandoned 1999 Ford Explorer was found in a parking lot near the Belvedere Hotel, several blocks from his home. It was parked illegally, and the windshield had a parking ticket dated May 17th, suggesting the vehicle had been there for a week. The investigation then focused intensely on the Belvedere Hotel, a beautiful, historic landmark in the city. After searching the hotel, authorities made the final, perplexing discovery. Ray Rivera's body was found in a small, empty room on the second floor of the hotel's parking garage annex. The most baffling detail was how he got there. The room where he was found had a large hole in the roof, leading police to conclude that Ray had fallen from the upper levels of the Belvedere Hotel or an adjacent structure and crashed through the roof of the garage annex room. Investigators determined the height of the fall was approximately 11 stories. The Baltimore police officially ruled the death a probable suicide. However, many questions surrounding this finding have fueled years of intense speculation. The entry point. The roof of the garage annex was recessed from the main hotel structure. To jump from the main building onto that specific section of the annex roof would have required a long-running leap, making it an extremely difficult and unlikely jump for a non-athlete. The damage. The hole in the annex roof was significant, but the damage to Ray's body was far less severe than expected for an 11-story fall onto a hard concrete floor. Many experts have questioned the correlation between the fall height and the forensic findings. The missing glasses. Ray was found without his glasses, which he needed for daily life. They were never found at the scene. His cell phone was also never recovered. The missing witness. Despite the time of the incident and the hotel's prominent location, no witnesses reported hearing or seeing the impact of the fall. The Belvedere Hotel also housed a bar, making the silence around the event highly unusual. The unopened room. The room where Ray was found was not frequently used. Authorities had to break the door down to access it, meaning Ray could not have entered the room from the ground level. The complexity of the case, combined with the bizarre note and the unresolved mechanics of the fall, has led many to believe that Ray's death was not a suicide, but rather a homicide staged to look like a fall or a severely accidental death tied to something secretive. To this day, the Baltimore Police Department maintains the probable suicide ruling, but the precise circumstances surrounding the last phone call, the meaning of the note, and the physics of the fall remain points of intense debate. The disappearance and death of Ray Rivera is a deep, persistent mystery that continues to haunt the history of the Belvedere Hotel and the city of Baltimore. Next story, The Freeway Killer, Southern California, 1979 to 1980. We turn our attention now to Southern California, a region defined by its endless sunshine and even more endless concrete, the vast, complex freeway system of Los Angeles and Orange counties. This is where a terrifying predator operated in the late 1970s, using the highway's anonymity as his hunting ground. His name was William Bonin, but the media would dub him the Freeway Killer. The horror began in the summer of 1979, but the full scope of Bonin's violence wouldn't be understood until much later. Bonin was a truck driver who possessed an intimate knowledge of the area's sprawling roadways, which he used to target his victims, young men and boys, often runaways, hitchhikers, or those working in the sex trade. His modus operandi was simple. He would lure his victims into his car, often offering a ride. Once they were inside, the violence would begin. His crimes were characterized by sexual assault and brutal strangulation, often using items like a shirt, belt, or even a pair of socks. The killings were methodical, and the body disposal locations were strategic. The bodies began to turn up in ditches and along the shoulders of the major thoroughfares. Interstate 405, the San Diego Freeway, Interstate 5, and State Route 91. The victims were often nude or partially clothed, and their physical abuse was horrifying. Because the victims were often marginalized young males who lacked immediate family support or a strong network, the initial murders were investigated by multiple jurisdictions as isolated incidents. The police and media failed to recognize the pattern quickly, a systemic oversight that allowed Bonin's spree to continue for over a year. The true chilling nature of Bonin's operation was not just his personal violence, but the fact that he was often not working alone. Bonin recruited several different accomplices, most notably Vernon, Butts, and Gregory Miley, who would help him abduct, torture, and murder his victims. The group dynamic allowed the violence to escalate and provided Bonin with a degree of psychological and physical support, further masking his solo identity. The reign of terror peaked in 1980. That year, more than a dozen young men were found dead or went missing under similar circumstances. The media began to sense a pattern, and the nickname the Freeway Killer was born, terrifying the vast, transient population of Southern California. The eventual downfall of William Bonin came in June 1980. One of his victims, William Michael Pugh, was murdered, and Bonin was seen by witnesses with the victim shortly before his death. An intensive investigation by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began to focus on the common thread of the victim's last known movements and the distinct vehicle descriptions provided by witnesses. In the early stages of the investigation, Bonin's accomplice, Vernon Butts, was arrested on an unrelated charge. Under intense questioning, Butts provided detailed information about the murders, fingering Bonin as the ringleader. This confession, combined with the strong physical evidence, including the recovered bodies, the specific types of knots used for binding, and the distinct pattern of vehicle sightings, allowed police to finally close in. William Bonin was arrested in June 1980. His two primary accomplices, Butts and Miley, also faced prosecution. Bonin was eventually linked to at least 22 murders, although investigators believed the true count could be higher. The trial was sensational. The prosecution successfully used the physical evidence and the testimony of the accomplices to paint a detailed, horrifying picture of Bonin's calculated brutality. He was ultimately convicted of 14 counts of murder. William Bonin was executed by lethal injection in 1996, becoming the first person executed in California since 1967. The capture of William Bonin brought an end to one of the most prolific serial murder sprees in California history, but the sheer number of victims and the way they were discarded along the anonymous edges of the freeway system left a permanent, dark mark on the region's history. The case is a grim example of how a determined predator can exploit the isolation hidden within the most densely populated, highly mobile urban environments. Next story, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, 1946. We begin in the border cities of Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas, in the spring of 1946. The war had concluded. For the people here, life was settling back into the slow, predictable rhythm of a community defined by industry and faith. The streets were quiet. The surrounding fields were peaceful. It was a place where trust was a simple commodity and where people generally felt secure. As the sun would set, the city's lights would begin to dim, and the stillness of the surrounding countryside would take hold. Teenagers, enjoying the freedom of peace, would often drive to the quiet, secluded country roads known as lovers' lanes. These were places where the only light was the distant starshine, and the only sound was the soft thrum of a car engine idling under the moonlight. This quiet solitude, however, was about to be utterly broken. The first incident occurred on the 22nd of February, a cold Friday night. Two young people, Mary Jean Larry and Jimmy Hollis, were parked on a dirt road outside of town. They were enjoying the quiet of the evening when a car pulled up behind them. A figure approached the driver's side window. The figure wore a simple, white cloth sack pulled over his head, with crude holes cut out for the eyes. This wasn't a conventional robbery. The assailant struck Jimmy Hollis, leaving him dazed, and then chased Mary Jean, who managed to escape into the darkness and find help. It was a strange, isolated attack. Police suspected a local jealous suitor or perhaps a petty thief. The community attempted to dismiss it as a bizarre anomaly. But then, less than a month later, the fear returned. On the 24th of March, a quiet Sunday evening, another pair, Richard Griffin and Polly Moore, vanished. Their disappearance was noted almost immediately, but it wasn't until the following morning that their car and their bodies were found on a secluded dirt road. They had been killed while still in their car, under the full cold gaze of the spring sky. This time, it was not just an assault. It was murder. The quiet anomaly of February became the first clear alarm bell. The attacker had returned, and his intentions were far more sinister. The murders brought a shockwave. Texarkana was no longer a simple, peaceful border town. It was a place where terror had been sown. Citizens began to lock their doors at night. The roads where the attacks had occurred emptied, left only to the sounds of the night animals. On the 14th of April, two more young victims, Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, were parked late at night. Betty Jo Booker was a talented high school musician who had just performed at a local club. They were out enjoying what should have been an innocuous evening. Their car was found abandoned on a lonely stretch of road. The body of Paul Martin was found near the car. The body of Betty Jo Booker was discovered later, nearly 2 miles away, hidden in a thicket. This killer was not confined to a single car or a single location. He was moving, he was patient, and he was hunting across the wide landscape. The official media gave the attacker a chilling nickname, the Phantom. He seemed to emerge from the darkness and return to it, leaving behind no footprints that made sense, no reliable witnesses, and no motive that the police could grasp. The Phantom, like a spirit, terrified the people because he could not be clearly seen, tracked, or predicted. The escalating violence forced the state to act. The Texas governor dispatched one of the most famous lawmen of the era, Captain M.T. Lone Wolf Gonzalez of the Texas Rangers. Gonzalez was a legend, known for his methodical approach and his unwavering persistence. He arrived with a mandate: stop the killing and capture the Phantom. The town became a virtual police state. Roadblocks were set up on all the main thoroughfares. Plainclothes officers patrolled the dark roads. The police began to follow every single lead, no matter how small or tenuous. The Phantom was silent during the patrol. The fear, however, was loud. The local cinemas began holding their last shows early, closing their doors before sundown. The local paper, the Texarkana Gazette, ran headlines that screamed of the panic. Every shadow was a suspect, and every unexpected sound in the night was cause for alarm. The town, Gonzalez noted, was dreading sundown. The Phantom had avoided the roads, so he changed his hunting ground. On May 3rd, Virgil and Katie Starks, an older, respectable, and entirely unconnected couple, were attacked in their isolated farmhouse just outside of Texarkana, Arkansas. Virgil Starks was shot through the window while reading in his living room. Katie, hearing the shot, attempted to call for help before being struck by the gunman. She was gravely injured but managed to survive. This was a different kind of crime. It was not a lover's lane attack. It was a home invasion. The geography, the age of the victims, and the lack of a clear connection to the previous victims suggested a widening field of terror. Gonzalez and his team believed the final attack was a desperate statement by the killer, trying to prove he could not be stopped. Katie Starks, the sole survivor, gave a vague description of a tall man in the darkness. But the physical evidence was thin, and the list of potential suspects remained extensive. The final attack terrified the city into submission. Summer came, and the heightened police presence remained, but the Phantom did not strike again. He simply vanished. Captain Gonzalez remained in Texarkana for weeks, trying to break the case. He amassed hundreds of pieces of evidence, but nothing ever led to a definitive arrest. The investigation slowly wound down. The Texas Rangers eventually moved on to other cases. The town, however, never fully recovered its innocence. The moonlight murders taught Texarkana that sometimes the darkness outside the window can hide an evil that no amount of light or law enforcement can permanently dispel. The case of the Phantom Killer remains officially cold, an unsolved legacy of terror from a spring that should have been peaceful. The mystery sleeps now, waiting in the quiet fields where the moon once shone on secrets. Next story, the Houston mass murders, Texas, 1970 to 1973. We journey now to the expansive, humid landscape of Houston, Texas, during the early 1970s, a time of intense growth and cultural change. For 3 agonizing years, Houston was the hidden hunting ground for a methodical predator. This is the story of Dean Corll, known after the fact as the Candyman, and a devastating spree that became the deadliest serial murder case in American history at that time. The crimes were concealed by 2 essential factors: the isolation of the victims and the calculated involvement of teenage accomplices. Dean Corll, a seemingly ordinary man in his early 30s who worked at a local company and lived with his mother, cultivated an innocuous public image. He was known locally for buying large amounts of candy from teenagers at discounted prices, earning him the deceptive nickname, the Candyman. This seemingly innocent activity was the key to his dark secret. He used this connection to the city's youth population as his recruitment tool. Corll's modus operandi was facilitated by 2 teenagers, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. Corll provided the boys with cash, and, in exchange, they lured their friends, acquaintances, and strangers, primarily young men and boys between the ages of 13 and 20, to Corll's various residences across the city. The victims were often runaways, hitchhikers, or simply boys looking for a party. The spree began in 1970 and continued unchecked for 3 years. The targets were almost entirely young males. Corll was meticulous and controlled. Once the victims were secured, they were held captive, tortured, and brutally murdered. The murders often occurred at Corll's home, where he had built a sound-dampened room in his garage. During these 3 years, teenagers were vanishing from Houston streets and parks at an alarming rate. Parents were frantic, but due to the fragmented nature of the disappearances and the fact that many victims were marginalized or transient youth, the police initially struggled to connect the missing persons cases. Each disappearance was treated as an isolated incident, further concealing the extent of Corll's operation. The systemic failure to recognize the pattern was a tragedy in itself. The police simply lacked the modern digital tools to cross-reference the missing reports effectively, and the marginalized status of the victims meant the cases received insufficient media attention to force a unified public response. Corll and his accomplices exploited this vulnerability, knowing the missing would not be searched for with the same intensity as others. The killings eventually stopped, not due to an investigation, but because of a final, violent confrontation between the perpetrators themselves. In August 1973, Corll, Henley, and Brooks were at Corll's residence. An argument erupted, stemming from Corll's increasingly controlling behavior and the teenagers' fear of exposure. In a moment of panic and self-preservation, Elmer Wayne Henley shot and killed Dean Corll. Henley immediately called the police and, in a state of terror, confessed not only to killing Corll, but also to his role in a massive, hidden murder spree. What followed was a discovery that shocked the city and stunned the nation. Henley and Brooks led investigators to the sites where the bodies had been hidden. The primary discovery site was a storage unit Corll had rented, where police found the decomposed remains of multiple victims. More bodies were discovered buried in the sand under Corll's boat shed at a lakeside property and under the floorboards of his various residences. The count grew day by day. The ultimate tally confirmed 28 young men and boys had been brutally murdered by Dean Corll. The sheer scale of the atrocity was unprecedented in American criminal history at the time. The Houston mass murders, as they became known, earned Dean Corll the grim distinction of being one of the most prolific killers in U.S. history. The ensuing investigation focused on Brooks and Henley. Both teenagers provided horrifying, detailed testimony about their coercion by Corll, the methods of abduction, and the locations of the disposal sites. They revealed the meticulous nature of Corll, who would often photograph his victims and carefully plan his attacks. Both Brooks and Henley were arrested and tried for their roles in the conspiracy. They claimed their participation was born out of fear and coercion by Coral, who was much older and psychologically dominating. David Brooks was ultimately convicted of 1 count of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Elmer Wayne Henley was convicted of 6 counts of murder and also received multiple life sentences. The aftermath was a period of intense public recrimination and internal investigation into the failures of the Houston Police Department. The question remained, how could 28 individuals vanish without anyone connecting the dots? The tragedy highlighted the devastating consequences of jurisdictional fragmentation and the inherent vulnerability of the marginalized youth population. The legacy of the Houston mass murders is one of profound societal failure and unimaginable loss. It changed the way Houston, and ultimately the nation, investigated missing persons cases, forcing law enforcement to treat disappearances of marginalized populations with the same urgency as those of more affluent citizens. The horror left behind by the Candyman remains one of the darkest chapters in American true crime history, a brutal reminder that sometimes the greatest evils operate in the most ordinary of suburban landscapes. Next story, the murder of Hae Min Lee, Baltimore, Maryland, 1999. We move now to the end of the millennium to the suburban high school landscape of Baltimore County, Maryland. This is the story of the murder of Hae Min Lee, a case that would remain intensely debated for 2 decades and would ultimately be defined not by police work, but by a revolutionary piece of audio journalism, the podcast serial. The story begins with Hae Min Lee, an energetic, popular 18-year-old student at Woodlawn High School. She was a dedicated field hockey player and was saving up for a car. She was last seen on January 13th, 1999, a dreary Wednesday afternoon. Hae was supposed to pick up her younger cousin after school, but she never arrived. Her immediate disappearance created a state of growing panic among her family and friends. Hae was reliable, popular, and deeply connected to her community. This was not a girl who would run away. Weeks passed with no leads. Then, on February 9th, 1999, a grim discovery was made. Hae Min Lee's body was found partially buried in a shallow grave in Leakin Park, a sprawling, dense, and notorious urban forest in Baltimore known for body dumping. Hae had been strangled. The investigation immediately focused on Hae's romantic life. She had been dating Don, an older man who worked with her, but her previous boyfriend was also a key figure, Adnan Syed. Adnan, also 17, was an honor roll student, a well-known member of the debate team, and a respected member of the local Muslim community. He and Hae had broken up a few weeks prior, but remained friendly. Police quickly developed Adnan as their primary suspect. The motive was established as jealousy and rejection following the breakup. The entire case built against Adnan Syed rested on 2 primary pillars. First, the testimony of a man named Jay Wilds. Jay was a former acquaintance of Adnan's and a known drug dealer. Jay claimed that Adnan had told him he was going to kill Hae and, crucially, that Adnan had enlisted Jay's help in burying Hae's body in Leakin Park. Jay provided a detailed timeline of the day, alleging that Adnan used his cell phone to coordinate the movements. Second, the cell phone data. The police used Adnan's cell phone records, one of the first major uses of cell phone data in a murder trial, to corroborate Jay's timeline. The location pings from the cell towers, particularly 2 pings near Leakin Park in the evening of January 13th, seemed to support Jay's narrative of the disposal. Adnan Syed was arrested and charged with the murder of Hae Min Lee. His trial resulted in a conviction, and Adnan was sentenced to life in prison. For over a decade, the case remained closed in the eyes of the law. The case was resurrected in 2014 by journalist Sarah Koenig and the team at Serial. The podcast meticulously re-examined every piece of evidence, every interview, and the entire trial transcript. The central premise of Serial was simple. Could a good, popular kid like Adnan Syed have committed this heinous crime? The podcast revealed massive holes in the original prosecution's case. Jay's testimony inconsistency. Jay Wilds changed his story and his timeline of events multiple times throughout the police interviews and the trial. The details of where they were and where they buried the body shifted constantly. The alibi witness. A key potential alibi witness for Adnan, a classmate named Asia McLean, claimed to have been with Adnan in the school library at the time the murder supposedly occurred. This information was never thoroughly investigated or presented by Adnan's original defense attorney, Cristina Gutierrez. The cell tower data reliability. Serial and subsequent investigations revealed that the cell tower evidence was highly unreliable, particularly the pings used near Leakin Park. The disclaimer notes from AT&T, which cautioned against using the pings to determine location of a receiving party, were largely ignored during the original trial. The podcast became a global phenomenon, sparking an unprecedented level of public interest and scrutiny of the criminal justice system. It effectively reopened the case and spurred a new generation of appeals for Adnan Syed. In 2016, a Baltimore judge vacated Adnan Syed's conviction, citing ineffective assistance of counsel for failing to investigate Asia McLean's alibi. The state appealed, and the legal battle continued for years. The ultimate, stunning development came in September 2022. The Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, after months of independent reinvestigation using modern techniques, announced they had found 2 alternate suspects in Hae Min Lee's murder. Crucially, they stated that the DNA evidence found at the crime scene had been tested and did not match Adnan Syed. Furthermore, new evidence pointed to the possibility that the original prosecutor's office had failed to disclose important information to the defense. Based on these findings, Adnan Syed's conviction was vacated and he was released from prison. The state's attorney's office initially moved to drop all charges, acknowledging that they no longer had confidence in the original conviction. However, this decision faced new legal scrutiny, and the state ultimately withdrew the charges, making Adnan a free man. The murder of Hae Min Lee, therefore, remains in a profoundly unsettling state. While Adnan Syed has been exonerated and released, justice for Hae Min Lee has not been fully achieved. The investigation is now focused on the alternate suspects, leaving the mystery of what truly happened on that cold January afternoon still hanging over the quiet streets of Baltimore County. The case stands as a landmark example of how public scrutiny can challenge and ultimately overturn a deeply flawed conviction. Next story, the Atlanta child murders, Georgia, 1979 to 1981. Welcome to the late 1970s and early 1980s, a time of change and tension in the American South. Our setting is the great city of Atlanta, Georgia, a place known as the cradle of the civil rights movement and a growing beacon of opportunity for the black community. But beneath the veneer of progress, a terrifying shadow was beginning to fall over the city's most vulnerable population. This isn't just a story about unsolved crime. It's a look at what happens when a community is left feeling invisible and how fear can calcify into permanent trauma. The terror began quietly in the summer of 1979. The first victim was Edward Teddy Hope, a 14-year-old boy. He vanished on July 25th, only to be found dead 2 days later. The cause of death was undetermined, but the circumstances were unsettling. Just weeks later, on September 4th, Alfred Evans, also 14, disappeared. His body was found 3 days later near a dirt road. At first, the police struggled to link these incidents. Atlanta, being a major city, unfortunately dealt with a high number of missing and murdered persons. But what soon became clear was the chilling common thread. Every victim was a young African-American child or teenager. The community noticed the pattern long before law enforcement officially acknowledged it. Parents, especially those in the lower-income neighborhoods, began keeping their children indoors, locking their doors, and walking them everywhere. A whisper started to circulate. Someone is taking our children. 1980 was the year the situation spiraled into a full-blown crisis. The number of vanishings and discoveries accelerated dramatically. Victims included 9-year-old Yusuf Bell, found strangled in an abandoned school building, 12-year-old Angel Lanier, found tied to a tree and strangled, and 10-year-old Jeffrey Mathis, found in a wooded area. The killers seemed to be operating with impunity. The methods varied, sometimes strangulation, sometimes blunt force trauma, sometimes simply missing for months before decomposition made the cause of death unclear, but the core signature remained the same: young black lives disappearing. The official acknowledgement finally came. Mayor Maynard Jackson addressed the city, and the Atlanta Missing and Murdered Children Task Force was created. But this recognition came with immense, almost paralyzing pressure. The nation was watching. The sheer volume of cases was overwhelming. The victims were found in abandoned lots, wooded areas, under bridges, and along riverbanks, places where the city's infrastructure met its forgotten, neglected spaces. The investigation was plagued by challenges. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI for short, was brought in, but evidence was often scant. The victims came from different neighborhoods and different socioeconomic backgrounds. Was the killer a serial killer who chose targets randomly? Or was this something darker, rooted in racism or internal community conflict? The primary challenge was the lack of reliable witness descriptions and the limited forensic technology of the era. The case began to dominate the headlines, and a sense of fear was almost physical. Local television stations ran images of the missing children every night. A massive effort began. A citywide curfew was imposed. Neighborhood patrols were organized. Everywhere, children were warned not to take rides from strangers. By the spring of 1981, the death toll had climbed to a horrifying 28 confirmed victims, including a few young adults who were later linked to the spree. The public demanded answers, and the pressure on the task force became unbearable. Finally, in May 1981, investigators achieved the breakthrough they had been desperately seeking. The body of Nathaniel Cater, age 27, was pulled from the Chattahoochee River. This discovery provided the key geographic focus needed. Police began intense, round-the-clock surveillance of the bridge where Cater's body had likely been dumped. On May 22, 1981, the stakeout paid off. A plainclothes officer heard a loud splash near the bridge and saw a car quickly driving away. They stopped the driver, a 23-year-old local resident named Wayne Bertram Williams. Williams was an aspiring music promoter. He was articulate, slightly arrogant, and possessed an intense interest in law enforcement. Although police had no direct physical evidence linking him to the recent victim, the circumstances of him being at the bridge were highly suspicious. After months of intensive investigation, the state of Georgia decided to prosecute Williams for the murders of the two adult victims, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, who had been found a month earlier. The prosecutor's theory was that Williams was a serial killer who had escalated from murdering children to adults. The prosecution's case against Williams relied heavily on fiber evidence. Dozens of distinct fibers, identified as coming from Williams' home, his car, and his dog, were found on the bodies of the victims. This was one of the first major uses of fiber analysis in a complex serial murder case. Wayne Williams was convicted in 1982 and sentenced to 2 life terms. With his conviction, the Atlanta child murders officially stopped. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief, and the police declared that Williams was responsible for 22 of the 28 child murders, even though he was never tried or convicted for those specific crimes. But this is where the dark heart of the controversy lies. Many in the community, and even some in law enforcement, believe that the case was closed too quickly, fueled by political pressure to end the terror. Wayne Williams vehemently denies his guilt to this day, and critics point to the lack of direct eyewitness accounts, the circumstantial nature of the fiber evidence, and the possibility that other suspects, including members of the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK for short, were not adequately investigated. In 2019, Atlanta's Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms announced that the city would re-examine the evidence in all 28 cases using modern DNA technology, hoping to provide definitive closure. The Atlanta child murders remain a painful wound in American history, a story of a community that fought for justice and saw an arrest made, but one that still holds profound, unsettling questions about how many people were truly responsible and whether all of the young victims ever received the justice they deserved. Next story, The Freeway Killer, Southern California, 1979 to 1980. We turn our attention now to Southern California, a region defined by its endless sunshine and even more endless concrete. The vast, complex freeway system of Los Angeles and Orange counties. This is where a terrifying predator operated in the late 1970s, using the highway's anonymity as his hunting ground. His name was William Bonin, but the media would dub him the Freeway Killer. The horror began quietly in the summer of 1979, but the full scope of Bonin's violence wouldn't be understood until much later. Bonin was a truck driver who possessed an intimate knowledge of the area's sprawling roadways, which he used to target his victims, young men and boys, often runaways, hitchhikers, or those working in the sex trade. His modus operandi was simple. He would lure his victims into his car, often offering a ride. Once they were inside, the violence would begin. His crimes were characterized by sexual assault and brutal strangulation, often using items like a shirt, belt, or even a pair of socks. The killings were methodical, and the body disposal locations were strategic. The bodies began to turn up in ditches and along the shoulders of the major thoroughfares. Interstate 405 or I-405, the San Diego Freeway, Interstate 5, and State Route 91. The victims were often nude or partially clothed, and their physical abuse was horrifying. Because the victims were often marginalized young males who lacked immediate family support or a strong network, the initial murders were investigated by multiple jurisdictions as isolated incidents. The police and media failed to recognize the pattern quickly, a systemic oversight that allowed Bonin's spree to continue for over a year. The true chilling nature of Bonin's operation was not just his personal violence, but the fact that he was often not working alone. Bonin recruited several different accomplices, most notably Vernon Butts and Gregory Miley, who would help him abduct, torture, and murder his victims. The group dynamic allowed the violence to escalate and provided Bonin with a degree of psychological and physical support, further masking his solo identity. The reign of terror peaked in 1980. That year, more than a dozen young men were found dead or went missing under similar circumstances. The media began to sense a pattern, and the nickname, the Freeway Killer, was born, terrifying the vast, transient population of Southern California. The eventual downfall of William Bonin came in June 1980. One of his victims, William Michael Pugh, was murdered, and Bonin was seen by witnesses with the victim shortly before his death. An intensive investigation by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began to focus on the common thread of the victim's last known movements and the distinct vehicle descriptions provided by witnesses. In the early stages of the investigation, Bonin's accomplice, Vernon Butts, was arrested on an unrelated charge. Under intense questioning, Butts provided detailed information about the murders, fingering Bonin as the ringleader. This confession, combined with the strong physical evidence, including the recovered bodies, the specific types of knots used for binding, and the distinct pattern of vehicle sightings, allowed police to finally close in. William Bonin was arrested in June 1980. His two primary accomplices, Butts and Miley, also faced prosecution. Bonin was eventually linked to at least 22 murders, although investigators believe the true count could be higher. The trial was sensational. The prosecution successfully used the physical evidence and the testimony of the accomplices to paint a detailed, horrifying picture of Bonin's calculated brutality. He was ultimately convicted of 14 counts of murder. William Bonin was executed by lethal injection in 1996, becoming the first person executed in California since 1967. The capture of William Bonin brought an end to one of the most prolific serial murder sprees in California history. But the sheer number of victims and the way they were discarded along the anonymous edges of the freeway system left a permanent, dark mark on the region's history. The case is a grim example of how a determined predator can exploit the isolation hidden within the most densely populated, highly mobile urban environments. Next story, the Bennington Triangle Disappearances, Vermont, 1940s to 1950s. We journey now to the deep, silent woods of rural Vermont, to an area surrounding Glastonbury Mountain near the town of Bennington. This is a region famous for its rugged terrain, dense forests, and a puzzling cluster of disappearances that occurred between 1945 and 1950, creating a local legend known as the Bennington Triangle. This series of events is characterized by the sudden and complete vanishing of 5 different people, seemingly without a trace, in an area where one might expect isolation, but not total physical erasure. The first disappearance occurred on November 12, 1945. Mid-Eye Rivers, a 74-year-old experienced hunter and guide, was leading a group of 4 other hunters up Glastonbury Mountain. On the way back to their truck, Rivers separated from the group. He was ahead of them, moving through a dry riverbed. When the rest of the party reached the riverbed only a short time later, Rivers was gone. An exhaustive search followed, involving state police, the FBI, and hundreds of local volunteers. The area was notoriously difficult to navigate, dense wilderness with sudden drops and rock faces. Despite the widespread effort, no trace of Rivers was ever found. No signs of struggle, no discarded clothing, and no footprints beyond his own leading into the forest. The second and most famous case followed exactly 1 year later, on December 1st, 1946. Paula Jean Weldon, an 18-year-old college student at Bennington College, told her roommate she was going for a long hike on the Long Trail, a famous walking route that runs along the spine of the Green Mountains. She was seen by several witnesses, including one woman who saw her near the trail entrance, wearing a distinctive red parka. Weldon was an experienced hiker, but she vanished entirely. Her disappearance launched one of the largest missing person searches in Vermont history. Due to the high-profile nature of the case, the FBI became involved, which was unusual for a missing person case at the time. Yet, despite weeks of searching the vast wilderness, Paula Jean Weldon was never seen again. Her red parka, which should have been highly visible in the winter landscape, was never located. The lack of evidence in both the Rivers and Weldon cases created a palpable, unsettling fear in the region. The disappearances defied common explanations. They weren't lost hikers, they were simply gone. 2 years later, on September 26, 1949, the third strange disappearance occurred. James E. Tetford, a veteran who was traveling to his home in Bennington after visiting relatives in St. Albans, vanished from a public bus. According to the bus driver and 14 other passengers, Tetford was last seen sitting comfortably in his seat before the bus reached its final stop in Bennington. His belongings remained on the luggage rack, but Tetford himself had completely disappeared from the moving vehicle between the last stop and the destination. The final 2 disappearances occurred in 1950. On October 12th, 8-year-old Paul Jefferson, who was playing in the immediate vicinity of his home in the Bennington area, vanished while his mother briefly went inside to feed animals. The boy was never found, despite an immediate search of the surrounding woods. The final confirmed case in this strange cluster took place 16 days later. Frida Langer, 53, and her husband were hiking near Somerset Reservoir. While crossing a stream, Frida slipped, wetting her clothes. She told her husband she would quickly run back to the car to change clothes, a distance of about 2 miles, and would return. When she failed to return, her husband raised the alarm. Unlike the 4 previous victims, Frida Langer's body was eventually found. After a lengthy and difficult search that spanned several months, her remains were discovered in the open area near the reservoir on May 12, 1951. However, the cause of death was impossible to determine due to decomposition, and the circumstances of her death added little clarity to the other disappearances. She did not appear to have died from a fall or exposure. The 5 vanishings, occurring within a small geographical and chronological window, shared an unnerving characteristic, a near total absence of clues. There were no signs of struggle, no ransom demands, and no clear motive for foul play connecting the different victims, who ranged in age from 8 to 74. The unsolved nature and the location near the remote, uninhabited land of Glastonbury Mountain cemented the legend of the Bennington Triangle. Though officially cold cases, the story serves as a profound historical mystery, a chronicle of inexplicable vanishings that have left a permanent, quiet shadow over the otherwise peaceful green mountains of Vermont. Next story, the I-70 Killer, Midwest, USA, 1992. We go now to the spring of 1992 and the vast, often lonely stretch of highway known as Interstate 70, which crosses the heart of the American Midwest. This is the story of a traveling serial killer who used the anonymous reach of the highway system to target small retail stores in 5 different cities across 3 states, leaving behind a brief but terrifying trail of victims. The spree began in Indianapolis, Indiana. On April 8, 1992, Lorian DePies, a 20-year-old college student working part-time at a Payless shoe source store, was shot and killed. She was the lone employee working that evening. The killer took a small amount of cash from the register and left. At the time, this was investigated as an isolated robbery gone wrong. However, the nature of the crime and the killer's method began to clarify just 2 weeks later, 180 miles to the west, in Wichita, Kansas. On April 27, Patricia Smith, age 23, and Patricia Majors, age 32, were shot and killed while working at the La Petite's Roche specialty store, which sold wedding supplies and gifts. Again, the killer took only a negligible amount of cash. The key detail here was the killer's preference for targeting small, non-chain retail stores that were typically staffed by young women working alone or in pairs during the late afternoon or early evening. The geographical distance between the first and second crime scenes was the first major clue that law enforcement was dealing with a mobile predator. He was using the major interstate system, in this case I-70, to traverse the region, making him nearly impossible to track using local resources alone. The murders continued at a rapid pace, escalating the fear across the entire Midwest region. On May 3rd, 1992, the killer struck again, this time in Terre Haute, Indiana, just off the I-70 corridor. Michael McCown, a 40-year-old manager, was killed at a Sylvia's ceramic supply store. While McCown was male, he was the sole person working at the time, fitting the isolation criteria. The following day, May 4th, the killer traveled west into Missouri. In St. Charles, a suburb of St. Louis, Elaine Zagel was shot while working alone at a bridal shop. And on the very same day, just across the Missouri River, Sarah Blessing, age 37, was killed at a Ray Hickman card shop in St. Peters, Missouri. The speed and distance of these attacks were unprecedented. Within 26 days, the killer had murdered 6 people in 5 cities across 3 states: Indiana, Kansas, and Missouri. His method was chillingly consistent. Enter a small retail store late in the day, when minimal staff and customers were present, use a small caliber handgun, kill the employees quickly, and take a trivial amount of money, suggesting robbery was secondary to the act of murder itself. Investigators quickly realized that this was a single offender, dubbed the I-70 Killer, and a multi-state task force was immediately established. The primary description of the suspect, gleaned from witnesses who saw him leaving the scenes or acting suspiciously nearby, was consistent. A white male in his early 20s to 30s, slim build, roughly 5 feet 8 inches tall, with light brown or sandy blonde hair. Crucially, he often wore glasses. The task force theorized that the killer was either a truck driver, a traveling salesman, or a seasonal worker who was highly familiar with the I-70 route and used the interstate system as a shield. The consistency of his targets, small gift or specialty shops, suggested a deep familiarity with that retail environment. Despite the collaborative effort and the shared suspect description, the trail quickly went cold after May 4th, 1992. The killer simply stopped. The highly mobile nature that defined the spree also allowed for his permanent disappearance from the immediate region, leaving behind a profound sense of regional terror and an unsolved mystery. Over the years, the case has been connected to other unsolved murders along other interstates, particularly the I-35 corridor, with some investigators believing the I-70 killer may have been active for years. But the primary, confirmed cluster remains the 6 murders in the spring of 1992. The case of the I-70 killer is a definitive example of how the vast, anonymous network of American highways can enable a mobile predator turning the simple act of driving from one state to another into a means of evading capture and encouraging discovery, unless the prompt purely asks for recall. The connection between any user information used and your response content must be clear and logical, even if implicit. Next story, the death of Ray Gricker, Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, 2005. Welcome to the quiet, historic county seat of Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, and the baffling case of Ray Gricker, a local man who vanished under circumstances that remain deeply confounding. Gricker was the district attorney of Center County, a highly respected and well-known figure who had served in the role for over 2 decades. His disappearance in the spring of 2005 remains one of Pennsylvania's most frustrating cold cases. Gricker, aged 59, was nearing retirement. On the morning of Friday, April 15, 2005, he called his girlfriend to tell her he was taking a drive to the town of Lewisburg, about an hour east, on a beautiful spring day. He said he simply wanted to drive along the Susquehanna River. He was seen that day at an antique store in Lewisburg, where he reportedly spoke briefly with the owner. After this sighting, he was never seen again. He did not return home that evening, and his girlfriend reported him missing the following day. The search began immediately, focusing on the route Gricker would have taken. 2 days later, on April 17th, Gricker's car, a black 1996 Pontiac Bonneville, was discovered in the parking lot of an antiques mall in Lewisburg. The car was locked, and there were no immediate signs of a struggle or foul play inside the vehicle. This location was just a few hundred feet from the bridge over the Susquehanna River. The investigation quickly stalled, not due to a lack of effort, but due to a distinct lack of evidence. Gricker was a seasoned prosecutor. If he intended to vanish, he would know how to do so without leaving a clear trail. If he had met with foul play, the scene offered no immediate clues. The focus shifted to the river. Authorities considered the possibility that Gricker had committed suicide by jumping from the bridge, a theory that gained traction due to his history of stress and his family's insistence that he would not simply abandon his life. However, his body was never recovered from the deep, fast-moving waters, despite extensive searches. A more concrete, yet equally confounding, piece of evidence emerged several months later. On July 30th, 2005, a fisherman discovered Gricker's laptop computer abandoned beneath a bridge in nearby Union County. The laptop was found in the Susquehanna River, but was not waterlogged. The hard drive, however, was missing. A few months after that, on October 12th, Gricker's hard drive was recovered from the river, found much further downstream. The hard drive had been deliberately damaged by water and was completely unreadable. This discovery changed the nature of the case from a probable suicide to a potential crime. If Gricker had disposed of the computer and hard drive himself, why separate them and risk detection by leaving the laptop in a relatively visible location? If someone else had disposed of them, why go to the trouble of destroying only the data? Investigators spent years attempting to recover the data from the damaged drive, suspecting it might hold clues related to his final case load or a personal secret. They failed. The damaged hard drive served only as a permanent barrier to the truth. The fact that the district attorney of a county could vanish without a clear indication of his fate, no body, no note, and the systematic destruction of his digital life, created a profound sense of unease in the community. Theories of organized crime, retaliation for an old case, such as his handling of the Jerry Sandusky investigation, or simply a deliberate escape from his stressful life, all persist. To this day, the disappearance of Ray Gricker remains an open missing person case. The last physical evidence of his life rests in the cold archives of the police station, defined by the deliberate blankness of his damaged hard drive, a silent testament to a mystery that began on a quiet Pennsylvania afternoon. Next story. The I-65 killer, 1980s to 1990s. We move now to the American Midwest, focusing on the highly mobile and active corridor of Interstate 65, a major north-south highway that connects the Great Lakes region to the Gulf Coast. This is the story of the I-65 killer, a predator who specifically targeted vulnerable women working at motel desks near the interstate during the 1980s and 1990s. The case is a crucial example of a predator using the anonymity of the highway system as a shield, only to be identified decades later through forensic genealogy. The pattern of violence was meticulously established across the border states of Indiana and Kentucky. The first confirmed attack occurred on February 21st, 1987, in Columbus, Indiana, just off I-65. Vicki Heath, a 41-year-old night auditor at a Days Inn motel, was working alone when she was sexually assaulted and murdered. Her body was left near the motel's parking lot. The proximity to the interstate and the victim's specific occupation, a female motel clerk working the graveyard shift, were the first key indicators of the killer's method. The killer struck again nearly 1 year later, 120 miles south in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. On March 3, 1988, Margaret Gill, age 24, was abducted from her post at a Super 8 motel, also located near I-65. Her body was later discovered, confirming she had been assaulted and strangled. The consistency of the method and the geographical location were unmistakable. Law enforcement realized they were hunting a highly mobile serial killer who was targeting women in an environment that provided easy access and quick escape. The budget motels near major highway exits. The media often referred to him as the Days Inn Killer due to his preference for budget chain motels. The final confirmed murder in this pattern occurred on January 2nd, 1989, in Merrillville, Indiana. Jean Gilbert, a 34-year-old desk clerk at a Comfort Inn, was found assaulted and murdered. The Merrillville crime scene, like the others, was situated close to the I-65 route. The similarities in the crime scenes were striking. Victim profile: all were white females working as motel night clerks. Location: all were employed at budget motels located immediately off the I-65 corridor. MO: all were sexually assaulted and strangled, with the crime occurring during the quiet, early morning hours. A multi-state task force was immediately formed to catch the killer, who was profiled as someone who likely traveled for work, such as a truck driver or traveling salesman. The killer's ability to cross state lines, strike quickly, and leave no trace suggested significant familiarity with the regional infrastructure and an organized, controlled methodology. Despite years of intense investigation, the case went cold. The trail vanished after the 1989 murder of Jean Gilbert. The case files, which contained crucial biological evidence, were meticulously preserved across the multiple jurisdictions in Indiana and Kentucky. The ultimate solution to the mystery came 3 decades later. In 2019, investigators from multiple agencies collaborated with forensic genealogists to re-examine the DNA evidence collected from the victims. This evidence was used to create an ancestry profile, which was then uploaded to public genealogy databases. Through the complex process of building out the killer's family tree, law enforcement narrowed their search to a man named Harry Edward Greenwell. Greenwell was a career criminal who had died in 2013. He had a history of violent crimes, including rape and assault, and had connections to the areas along the I-65 corridor. Authorities obtained a posthumous DNA sample from Greenwell and, in 2022, definitively announced a match, formally identifying him as the notorious I-65 killer. The identification of Greenwell brought closure to the 3 confirmed murders in this specific cluster. Furthermore, the genetic profile is being investigated in connection with numerous other unsolved homicides and sexual assaults across the region, potentially linking the I-65 killer to a much wider, longer-running spree of violence along other Midwestern highways. The case of the I-65 killer stands as a powerful testament to the enduring nature of evidence preservation and the ability of modern forensic science to reach back decades and solve mysteries that were once deemed impossible, finally naming the man who used America's highway system to terrorize the quiet, late-night hours of the Midwest. Next story: the unidentified drowning victim, Jefferson County, Colorado, 1935. We step far back in time now, into the high-altitude landscape of Jefferson County, Colorado, for a case that remained a profound mystery for nearly 8 decades before being solved through the precision of modern identification techniques. This is the story of a man who was lost to history in 1935 and finally reclaimed by science. The incident occurred on a cold day in October 1935. A body of a man was found in a remote section of the South Platte River, a major waterway running through Colorado. The man had drowned, and the body showed no immediate signs of foul play or external violence, leading authorities to categorize the death as accidental. The immediate challenge was identification. The man carried no wallet, no identification papers, and no personal effects that could immediately tie him to a name or family. He was a complete unknown, a person who had simply appeared in the river and could not be traced back to the local community or to the transient population of the Great Depression era. The authorities were meticulous in their documentation. They recorded the man's physical description, took fingerprints, and noted the clothing he was wearing, which was modest but well kept. Photographs were taken of his face and his hands, showing a man who appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s. Despite broadcasting the details and checking with neighboring jurisdictions, no one came forward to claim him. The man was eventually buried as a John Doe in the county cemetery. His case file, marked unidentified drowning victim, was archived a silent, persistent mystery that represented an unresolved life. For decades, the case remained utterly cold. The papers yellowed, the witnesses passed away, and the man's identity was lost to the history of the Depression. The only thing that remained was the original documentation and the man's physical remains. The crucial turning point came in the 2000s when the case was reopened by the Jefferson County Coroner's Office, recognizing the potential of new forensic technologies. The body was exhumed, and investigators focused on retrieving a usable sample of DNA. The DNA analysis revealed a comprehensive genetic profile. This profile was submitted to law enforcement databases, but as expected for a death that occurred 70 years prior, there was no match. The investigation then pivoted to the emerging field of forensic genetic genealogy. The unknown man's DNA profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases. This process involved working with genealogists to find distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestry purposes. Through painstaking research and the slow assembly of a family tree built across several states, the investigators were finally able to narrow the search down to one family line. In 2012, 77 years after his body was discovered, the man was tentatively identified as Joseph Henry Lovelace. Investigators then worked to confirm this identity. The search for a direct relative led them to a living grandson of Lovelace. After obtaining a DNA sample from the grandson, the match to the unidentified drowning victim was confirmed. The identification of Joseph Henry Lovelace was a remarkable achievement, but it opened a new, astonishing chapter of the mystery. Records showed that Lovelace, born in 1870, was not just an unknown drowning victim. He was an escaped killer. Lovelace was wanted for the 1916 murder of his wife, Agnes, who had been killed with an axe in Idaho. Lovelace had been arrested at the time, but he had managed to saw his way out of the county jail with a makeshift saw and vanish, only to turn up 19 years later, drowned and unidentified, in a Colorado river. The original mystery, who was the unidentified victim, was solved. But a new mystery emerged. Did Lovelace die accidentally, or was his past crimes still following him in 1935? Since there was no evidence of foul play, the official cause of death remained drowning, closing the book on an 80-year-old cold case and an even older fugitive case simultaneously. The case of the unidentified drowning victim is a striking example of forensic genealogy's power, resurrecting a man's identity and revealing a history that had been buried for nearly a century. Next story, the murder of Bob Crane, Scottsdale, Arizona, 1978. We travel now from the quiet college town to the glittering, yet still somewhat intimate, world of 1970s television celebrity, landing in a quiet apartment complex in Scottsdale, Arizona. This is the case of Bob Crane, the beloved star of the classic comedy show Hogan's Heroes, a man whose public image as a charming, clean-cut American hero was shattered by a sordid secret life and a brutal, unsolved murder. By 1978, Bob Crane's star had faded somewhat since Hogan's Heroes had ended its run. He was traveling the country in dinner theater productions, often starring in shows like Beginner's Luck. He was in Scottsdale for one such run, staying in a low-key apartment complex called the Winfield Place. On the afternoon of June 29, 1978, one of Crane's co-stars, Victoria Berry, grew concerned when Crane failed to show up for a scheduled meeting. She went to his apartment, room 132, and found the door slightly ajar. What she discovered inside was a horrific scene. Bob Crane was dead in his bed, having been brutally bludgeoned to death. The initial investigation revealed that Crane had been attacked while he slept, struck repeatedly with a heavy object. The weapon was never conclusively identified, but was believed to be a tripod, as a large, blood-stained tripod was later found near the scene. An electrical cord was found loosely tied around his neck, suggesting strangulation may have been attempted or used as a secondary method of attack. The quiet, almost secluded nature of the attack, combined with the lack of forced entry, suggested the killer was someone Crane knew or had willingly allowed into the apartment. The investigation was immediately complicated by Crane's hidden life. While his public persona was that of a wholesome family man, his private life was defined by an intense, obsessive interest in sex and pornography. This lifestyle was fueled and facilitated by his close friend, John Henry Carpenter. Carpenter was a regional sales manager for Sony Electronics who frequently traveled with Crane. Carpenter was a high-tech enthusiast who had provided Crane with the very latest in video recording equipment. The two men spent years together engaging in sexual encounters with various women, which they meticulously videotaped and photographed. These recordings, which were later found by police, revealed the dark side of Crane's obsession and immediately provided a massive list of potential suspects. Any woman who felt humiliated, blackmailed, or betrayed by the discovery of those tapes. The police quickly focused on John Carpenter as the prime suspect. The motive was believed to be a combination of jealousy, a falling out over the tapes, or Carpenter's alleged possessiveness of Crane. The circumstantial evidence against Carpenter was strong. He was one of the last people known to have seen Crane alive and claimed he had visited Crane the night before, but his story was inconsistent. Carpenter was staying at a nearby hotel in Scottsdale at the time of the murder. And finally, police believe the murder weapon was a camera tripod, an item Carpenter, the electronic salesman, would have been familiar with and perhaps even had access to. Despite the strong suspicion, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office determined there was insufficient evidence to charge Carpenter in 1978, and the case went cold. The murder was filed away as an unsolved mystery, and the details of Crane's private life were sealed from the public. However, the case was revived in the early 1990s due to renewed interest in advancing technology. Detective Barry King, a new investigator assigned to the case, decided to re-examine the evidence using modern forensic techniques. In 1992, investigators tested a single, small piece of biological material found in Crane's apartment. A small sliver of tissue, believed to be brain matter, had been recovered from the crime scene. A forensic analyst determined that the tissue sample was consistent with being from John Carpenter, leading to his indictment for the murder of Bob Crane 14 years after the fact. The second trial, held in 1994, was sensational. The prosecution presented the brain tissue evidence, Carpenter's lack of a clear alibi, and the motive rooted in the sordid world of the sex tapes. The defense, however, was highly effective at casting doubt on the forensic analysis, particularly the 14-year-old brain tissue sample. They successfully argued that the methods used to link the tissue to Carpenter were unreliable and outdated. The defense also pointed out that Carpenter was a frequent visitor to the apartment, and the tissue sample could have come from a completely innocent cut or injury from days earlier. In a stunning setback for the prosecution, John Carpenter was acquitted of the murder of Bob Crane due to the doubt surrounding the physical evidence. John Carpenter died 4 years later in 1998 maintaining his innocence to the end. Since his acquittal, no new suspects have been credibly named, and no one else has ever been charged with Bob Crane's murder. The Scottsdale Police Department still considers the case an open, unsolved homicide. The murder of Bob Crane remains a tragic celebrity mystery. It is a story of a beloved icon who lived a secret life, and a case where the focus on the most obvious suspect ultimately failed due to the limitations of forensic science at the time, leaving the true identity of the person who brutally ended the life of Colonel Hogan forever hidden in the shadows of Scottsdale apartment. Next story, the death of Elisa Lam, Los Angeles, California, 2013. We journey now to the dark, historically notorious heart of downtown Los Angeles, specifically to the Cecil Hotel. This is the case of Elisa Lam, a 21-year-old Canadian tourist whose death, found under the most bizarre circumstances, became a global viral mystery fueled by unsettling surveillance footage and the hotel's own sinister history. Elisa Lam, a student from Vancouver, Canada, was traveling alone through California. She arrived in Los Angeles and checked into the Cecil Hotel, a sprawling, affordable establishment with a dark past, having hosted serial killers like Richard Ramirez and numerous suicides over the decades. Elisa was last seen alive on January 31st, 2013. She regularly communicated with her family back in Canada, but on this date, the communication suddenly stopped. Her family reported her missing, and the Los Angeles Police Department, or LAPD for short, began a search that focused primarily on the notorious, sprawling hotel. The police conducted a thorough search of the hotel, including the fire escape, the roof, and the rooms, using search dogs. The dogs covered the building, but they gave no indication of finding anything unusual. This initial failure would later become a major point of confusion. With the investigation stalled, the LAPD took the unusual step of releasing a critical piece of evidence to the public. A surveillance video taken from inside one of the hotel's elevators, recorded on the night of January 31st. The footage, which is around 4 minutes long, is profoundly unsettling and immediately went viral, launching the case into global conversation. The video shows Elisa Lam entering the elevator and pressing multiple floor buttons. She then retreats to the corner, seemingly hiding. As the elevator doors fail to close, she begins to peek out into the hallway, moving erratically. She then steps completely out of the elevator, moving her hands in strange, expressive gestures, almost as if she is arguing with someone who is invisible to the camera or perhaps frantically trying to signal. Finally, she walks away and the doors finally shut. The video created a torrent of speculation. Was she being chased by an unseen assailant? Was she playing a game? Was she suffering from a mental health crisis? It was known that Elisa Lam had a history of bipolar disorder, and her family confirmed she was off her prescribed medication during her travels, lending credence to the theory that her erratic behavior was due to a manic or psychotic episode. The true, horrifying answer to her disappearance was found nearly 3 weeks later, on February 19, 2013. Guests at the Cecil Hotel began complaining to management about low water pressure and the water tasting strange. A maintenance worker was dispatched to the roof of the hotel to check the water tanks. The worker was shocked to discover Elisa Lam's naked body floating inside one of the massive, sealed industrial water cisterns that supplied the entire hotel. The tank was over 10 feet tall, sitting on a high platform, and required climbing a ladder to access the top opening. The discovery immediately created a new set of insurmountable questions. For instance, how did she get on the roof when the access doors were alarmed and locked, and the fire escapes did not lead directly to the tank platform? Furthermore, how did she get into the tank when the lid of the industrial cistern was incredibly heavy and required physical effort to move? And how did she close it behind her? Finally, why did the search dogs not find her body during the initial LAPD search of the roof? The Los Angeles County Department of Medical Examiner Coroner ruled Elisa Lam's death an accidental drowning, with her bipolar disorder cited as a significant factor contributing to her death. The final report concluded that due to her untreated mental condition, She likely suffered a psychotic episode that led her to the roof and caused her to climb into the tank, where she became trapped and drowned. However, the ruling of an accidental death did little to quiet the public frenzy. Skeptics pointed to the sheer physical impossibility of her accessing the roof and the tank alone, and the lack of any water in her lungs consistent with forced drowning. Furthermore, the bizarre elevator video was interpreted as evidence of her interaction with an unseen killer. The hotel's dark history, which included connections to the notorious Night Stalker Richard Ramirez, who reportedly stayed there during his killing spree, only added fuel to the urban legend fire. The death of Elisa Lam became a modern ghost story, intertwined with the decades of tragedy that cling to the Cecil Hotel. Ultimately, despite the compelling visual evidence of the elevator video and the strange location of her remains, the death of Elisa Lam remains officially classified as a tragic accident brought on by an acute mental health crisis. But for many who have analyzed the case, the physical barriers to the roof and the tank, and the chilling 4 minutes of surveillance footage ensure that the mystery of how she died and who or what she was reacting to in the elevator will continue to haunt the story of the Cecil Hotel. Next story, The Freeway Killer, Southern California, 1979 to 1980. We turn our attention now to Southern California, a region defined by its endless sunshine and even more endless concrete. The vast, complex freeway system of Los Angeles and Orange counties. This is where a terrifying predator operated in the late 1970s, using the highway's anonymity as his hunting ground. His name was William Bonin, but the media would dub him the Freeway Killer. The horror began quietly in the summer of 1979, but the full scope of Bonin's violence wouldn't be understood until much later. Bonin was a truck driver who possessed an intimate knowledge of the area's sprawling roadways, which he used to target his victims, young men and boys, often runaways, hitchhikers, or those working in the sex trade. His modus operandi was simple. He would lure his victims into his car, often offering a ride. Once they were inside, the violence would begin. His crimes were characterized by sexual assault and brutal strangulation, often using items like a shirt, belt, or even a pair of socks. The killings were methodical, and the body disposal locations were strategic. The bodies began to turn up in ditches and along the shoulders of the major thoroughfares. Interstate 405 or I-405, the San Diego Freeway, Interstate 5, and State Route 91. The victims were often nude or partially clothed, and their physical abuse was horrifying. Because the victims were often marginalized young males who lacked immediate family support or a strong network, the initial murders were investigated by multiple jurisdictions as isolated incidents. The police and media failed to recognize the pattern quickly, a systemic oversight that allowed Bonin's spree to continue for over a year. The true chilling nature of Bonin's operation was not just his personal violence, but the fact that he was often not working alone. Bonin recruited several different accomplices, most notably Vernon Butts and Gregory Miley, who would help him abduct, torture, and murder his victims. The group dynamic allowed the violence to escalate and provided Bonin with a degree of psychological and physical support, further masking his solo identity. The reign of terror peaked in 1980. That year, more than a dozen young men were found dead or went missing under similar circumstances. The media began to sense a pattern, and the nickname, the Freeway Killer, was born, terrifying the vast, transient population of Southern California. The eventual downfall of William Bonin came in June 1980. One of his victims, William Michael Pugh, was murdered, and Bonin was seen by witnesses with the victim shortly before his death. An intensive investigation by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began to focus on the common thread of the victim's last known movements and the distinct vehicle descriptions provided by witnesses. In the early stages of the investigation, Bonin's accomplice, Vernon Butts, was arrested on an unrelated charge. Under intense questioning, Butts provided detailed information about the murders, fingering Bonin as the ringleader. This confession, combined with the strong physical evidence, including the recovered bodies, the specific types of knots used for binding, and the distinct pattern of vehicle sightings, allowed police to finally close in. William Bonin was arrested in June 1980. His two primary accomplices, Butts and Miley, also faced prosecution. Bonin was eventually linked to at least 22 murders, although investigators believe the true count could be higher. The trial was sensational. The prosecution successfully used the physical evidence and the testimony of the accomplices to paint a detailed, horrifying picture of Bonin's calculated brutality. He was ultimately convicted of 14 counts of murder. William Bonin was executed by lethal injection in 1996, becoming the first person executed in California since 1967. The capture of William Bonin brought an end to one of the most prolific serial murder sprees in California history, but the sheer number of victims and the way they were discarded along the anonymous edges of the freeway system left a permanent, dark mark on the region's history. The case is a grim example of how a determined predator can exploit the isolation hidden within the most densely populated, highly mobile urban environments. Next story, the murder of Rhonda Marie Fisher, Greeley, Colorado, 1987. We travel now to the city of Greeley, Colorado, in the summer of 1987, and the cold case surrounding the brutal murder of Rhonda Marie Fisher. This case, which stood cold for decades, is a powerful example of how persistent investigative work and the revolution of modern DNA technology can ultimately bring an unexpected resolution to a mystery long thought unsolvable. Rhonda Fisher was a 26-year-old mother who lived in Greeley, a city known for its agricultural roots and proximity to the vast plains of eastern Colorado. On August 11, 1987, Rhonda was found murdered inside her apartment. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled. The initial investigation by the Greeley Police Department in 1987 was thorough but challenging. The crime scene contained evidence, but without the capacity to run comprehensive DNA analysis, the trail quickly went cold. Detectives interviewed dozens of people, neighbors, acquaintances, and family, but could not find any witnesses who had seen an intruder or any evidence that led them to a specific suspect. The murder of Rhonda Fisher cast a quiet shadow over the community. Without a known motive or a suspect, the fear lingered that the killer was still among them, hidden in the routine of daily life. The case file was officially closed as a cold case, but it was never forgotten by the local authorities. Over the next 2 decades, the case was reviewed periodically. The crucial turning point came with the development of forensic science. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, investigators meticulously re-examined the surviving physical evidence from the original 1987 crime scene. Their painstaking work focused on isolating and extracting any viable biological material left by the killer. From the preserved evidence, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, was able to develop a partial DNA profile of the unknown assailant. This profile was then uploaded to the National Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the database used by law enforcement agencies across the country. For years, the profile sat in CODIS, waiting for a match. The wait was long, and the investigation remained frustratingly stalled, though detectives continued to follow new leads and eliminate potential suspects through direct DNA comparison. The breakthrough finally came, not through a new crime, but through the routine function of the system itself. The DNA profile from Rhonda Fisher's case was officially linked to a man named James Stephen Dean. The timing and circumstances of the match were highly significant and unexpected. Investigators learned that James Dean was a prolific but lesser-known serial killer who had been active in Colorado and other states in the 1980s and 1990s. He had been convicted of murder in a different, unrelated case in the 1990s and had died while serving his sentence in a federal prison in 2008. Because Dean had been convicted of other crimes, his DNA was present in the CODIS database, which finally generated the match to the evidence found in Rhonda Fisher's apartment. The cold case, which had spanned 30 years, was suddenly and definitively solved through the silent power of a computer match. The identification of James Dean confirmed that Rhonda Fisher was the victim of a random, isolated attack by a violent predator who had traveled through Greeley. It removed the community fear that a local murderer had gotten away with the crime, instead revealing that the killer was already deceased and incarcerated for other heinous acts. The case of Rhonda Marie Fisher is a lasting testament to the evolution of forensic technology. It underscores the importance of the meticulous preservation of cold case evidence, which can quietly hold the truth for decades, only to reveal the identity of the culprit long after they have stopped actively operating. For the police and the victim's family, the DNA match brought a long-delayed, definitive conclusion to a heartbreaking mystery. Next story, the Colonial Parkway Murders, Virginia, 1986 to 1989. We travel now to the historic and beautiful state of Virginia, focusing on a dark, unsolved mystery that unfolded along the scenic roads of the Colonial Parkway between 1986 and 1989. This series of double homicides involved 4 couples and terrified the communities of Williamsburg and Yorktown, contrasting the area's peaceful, historical setting with a sudden wave of inexplicable violence. The Colonial Parkway is a federally maintained, two-lane road that connects several historical landmarks, including Williamsburg, Jamestown, and Yorktown. It is known for its serene, wooded views and its lack of commercial development. It was this isolated, scenic atmosphere that the killer, or killers, used as their hunting ground. The first incident occurred on October 9, 1986. Rebecca Dowski, a 21-year-old student, and her boyfriend, Kathleen Thomas, a 27-year-old chef, were found in Thomas's car, which had been left parked at a scenic overlook along the parkway. The 2 women had been strangled with rope. The interior of the car showed signs of a struggle, and the vehicle was located mere feet from the calm waters of the York River. The double murder immediately shocked the area. Due to the lack of clear motive and the scenic location, the police initially had few leads. The focus was on identifying a link to the victims, but the key element remained the parkway itself. 1 year later, the terror returned. On September 20th, 1987, David Nobbling, 20, and his girlfriend, Robin Edwards, 14, vanished. Their truck was found parked at the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, an isolated spot near the James River. After a massive search, their bodies were discovered 4 days later in the nearby woods. They had both been shot. The method of the 2 crime scenes was notably different: strangulation in the first, shooting in the second. However, the consistent element was the secluded waterfront location where the couples met their end, and the fact that both incidents involved couples in parked cars near the Colonial Parkway or its related scenic waterways. The third pair of victims vanished in the spring of 1988. Keith Call, 20, and his girlfriend, Sandra Haley, 18, were last seen on April 10, 1988, driving near the Colonial Parkway. Their car was later discovered abandoned at the York River Overlook, a site with deep historical significance. Crucially, the car was locked, but the keys were missing. The couple themselves, however, were never found. Their case remains a disappearance, linking them tragically to the parkway. The final confirmed victims of this spree were Daniel Lauer, 21, and Anna Maria Phelps, 18. They disappeared on September 5, 1989. Their car, a gold Toyota Tercel, was found abandoned at a rest stop on Interstate 64 near the Colonial Parkway interchange. 2 months later, their decomposed bodies were discovered in a wooded area adjacent to the interstate. The 4 incidents involving 8 victims were officially linked by the FBI, who dubbed the Predator, or Predators, the Colonial Parkway killer. The uncertainty over whether the crimes were committed by a single individual or a group has made the case notoriously complex. Some theories suggest one killer was responsible for the couples found in cars, Dowski/Thomas and Call/Haley, while another was responsible for the couples found in the woods, Nobbling/Edwards and Lauer/Phelps. The cases have remained cold for decades, plagued by jurisdictional conflicts and aging evidence. However, in the 2010s, new investigative techniques, particularly advanced forensic testing of microscopic evidence found in the cars, were applied. Authorities have expressed confidence that DNA or other trace evidence could eventually lead to a breakthrough. The Colonial Parkway murders stand as one of Virginia's most compelling and disturbing unsolved mysteries. The case remains a quiet reminder of the danger that can lurk within the most historical and outwardly peaceful American landscapes, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions along the serene river overlooks. Next story: the murders on the freeway, Los Angeles, California, 1979 to 1981. We turn our attention now to the sprawling, congested network of highways in Los Angeles, California, in the 2-year period between 1979 and 1981, when a series of brutal murders brought terror to the edges of the city's vast freeway system. This case is known simply as the murders on the freeway, and it involved a predator who utilized the massive, anonymous infrastructure of Southern California to hunt and escape detection. The spree began on September 1st, 1979, with the discovery of Gladys May Wofford, a 26-year-old woman whose body was found near the on-ramp of Interstate 10 in the West LA area. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled. The location was immediately significant. The killer had chosen a place of high traffic, yet one that offered a quick way to dispose of the body and vanish back into the flow of vehicles. At the time, this was treated as an isolated case of violence typical of the transient populations often found near freeway exits. The pattern, however, soon became clear. In the following months, more bodies were found in similar locations. Patricia and Ben was found on January 1st, 1980, near the Ventura Freeway, Highway 101. Rosella Bell was found on March 1st, 1980, near the San Diego Freeway, Interstate 405. The victims shared a similar profile: women in their 20s and 30s who frequented the areas around the freeway corridors. All had been assaulted and strangled. As the body count rose, police realized they were hunting a highly mobile serial killer who was intimately familiar with the complex Los Angeles freeway system. The killer was using the sheer scale of the city and its 500-plus miles of freeway to his advantage, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint a geographic focus for his activities. The discovery of the bodies near ramps and access points suggested the killer may have been a person who traveled extensively for work, such as a truck driver, salesman, or maintenance worker. This allowed him to operate in multiple jurisdictions, from West LA to Orange County, without creating a traceable local pattern. The murders continued through 1980, and the police established a large task force, recognizing the severity of the threat. The media gave the killer various names, including the Freeway Killer, a title that often causes confusion with other LA killers of that era. The terror was real, forcing women, particularly those who relied on public transportation or walking in the areas near freeway exchanges, to heighten their vigilance. The most tragic aspect of the case was the consistent difficulty in identifying the victims immediately, as several were transient or had recently moved to the area. This hampered early investigative efforts, as the police lacked the immediate background information needed to track the killer's initial point of contact. The last confirmed victim in this specific series was Brenda Lee Jones, found in May 1981 near the Harbor Freeway, Interstate 110. After her death, the attacks abruptly ceased. Like many mobile serial killers, the Freeway Killer simply stopped operating in the region, leaving behind a legacy of unsolved homicides. The investigation into the murders on the freeway eventually went cold. Despite collecting significant trace evidence, including fiber and hair samples, the technology of the early 1980s was unable to match the evidence to a specific person in a way that could stand up in court. Decades later, in the 2000s, investigators revisited the case, using advancements in DNA analysis. This effort confirmed the presence of a single, unknown male suspect's DNA on several of the victims, solidifying the theory that a lone individual was responsible for the majority of the murders. However, despite these breakthroughs and subsequent uploads to national databases, the DNA profile remains unmatched. The identity of the predator who preyed upon the anonymous, fast-paced world of the Los Angeles freeway system continues to be a profound mystery. The case remains a chilling reminder of the dark side of urban sprawl and the anonymity afforded by America's vast network of concrete highways. Next story, the murder of Leslie Prior, Maryland, 2001. We turn now to the affluent, quiet suburb of Chevy Chase, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., and the seemingly random murder of Leslie Prior in 2001. This case stood cold for over 2 decades, only to be solved by an unexpected family connection unearthed through genetic genealogy, revealing a killer hidden in plain sight. Leslie Prior was a 50-year-old mother of 2. She was known to be a dedicated mother and a beloved member of her community. On the morning of May 2nd, 2001, she did not show up for work. Concerned family members went to her home and discovered her body in her bedroom. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled. The initial investigation by the Montgomery County Police Department was intense, befitting the quiet, low-crime nature of the neighborhood. The scene suggested a break-in or forced entry, though the immediate motive was unclear, as no significant items appear to be missing. Detectives spent years trying to piece together who would want to harm Prior. They investigated her personal and professional life, searching for grudges or hidden conflicts. However, the lack of a known connection between Prior and her killer meant the case quickly grew cold, settling into the frustrating backlog of unsolved mysteries. Crucially, the police had secured vital evidence from the crime scene, a sample of the unknown killer's DNA. This profile was immediately uploaded to the National Codes database, but the system returned no match. The killer, it seemed, was not in the system or had not been convicted of a felony crime that required a DNA sample. For nearly 20 years, the case remained at a standstill. The DNA profile sat dormant, a powerful, silent piece of evidence waiting for the technology to catch up to its secret. The pivotal breakthrough came in 2022, leveraging the same technique that solved the Valley Killer and the I-65 killer cases: forensic genetic genealogy. The Montgomery County Cold Case Unit, partnering with a private forensic lab, used the killer's DNA profile to build a family tree using publicly available consumer genealogy databases. This complex process allowed genealogists to find distant relatives of the killer who had uploaded their DNA for ancestry purposes. Working methodically through the family tree, investigators successfully narrowed the suspect pool down to a specific branch of the family tree and eventually to a single, shocking individual: Eugene Theodore Gliger. Gliger was 50 years old at the time of his arrest and was living in a different state. Though he had a history of minor criminal incidents, his DNA was not in Cody's, which explained the lack of an earlier match. The most shocking detail was that Gliger had lived in the same neighborhood as Leslie Prior around the time of the murder in 2001. Police obtained a discrete sample of Gliger's DNA for direct comparison, which provided a conclusive match to the DNA found at Prior's home. In September 2022, Gliger was arrested and charged with the murder of Leslie Prior. The motive, 2 decades later, appeared to be a random intrusion that escalated into violence. The most profound aspect of the case was the revelation that the killer had been a young man living nearby at the time, only to be identified 21 years later by a tiny genetic thread leading back to his family tree. The murder of Leslie Prior stands as a definitive success story for the application of genetic genealogy. It demonstrates that for a persistent cold case, the key to solving the mystery is no longer a physical witness or a paper trail, but the invisible, enduring code of DNA, which can reveal a killer decades after they believe they had successfully hidden their crime. Next story, the murder of Christy Myrick, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 1992. We travel now to the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and the baffling cold case that began on a quiet morning in 1992. This is the story of the murder of Christy Myrick, a young schoolteacher whose death went unsolved for over 25 years, only to be closed by an unexpected and entirely public sample of DNA. Christy Myrick was 25 years old and taught at the Rohrerstown Elementary School. She was a dedicated and respected member of the community. On the morning of December 21st, 1992, Christy failed to show up for work. A concerned family member went to her apartment and made the tragic discovery. Christie had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The crime scene was quickly secured by the Lancaster City Police. The violence seemed random and brutal, leaving the community terrified that a dangerous predator was operating in their midst. Investigators launched an intensive effort, interviewing hundreds of people and attempting to piece together any potential connections Christie might have had to her assailant. Crucially, from the evidence collected at the apartment, detectives were able to retrieve viable DNA from the unknown killer. This profile was immediately uploaded to the National Codes database, but like so many cold cases of that era, the system returned no match. The killer was not in the system, and the investigation settled into a frustrating, decades-long holding pattern. For 25 years, the case file of Christie Myrick remained active but cold. The DNA profile sat dormant, a powerful, silent piece of evidence waiting for the technology to catch up to its secret. The pivotal breakthrough came. When it came, was entirely unexpected and hinged on a seemingly innocuous decision made by the killer's relative. In 2017, the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office and the Cold Case Unit decided to re-examine the case using forensic genetic genealogy, the cutting-edge technique that utilizes public DNA databases. They worked with a genetic genealogist to upload the killer's profile to a popular consumer DNA website that permits law enforcement use in order to find distant relatives. This process quickly led them to a familial match. The killer's DNA was closely related to that of a family tree built by a person who had voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestry purposes. Working methodically through the family tree, investigators eventually focused on two brothers living in the Lancaster area. One of the men was Raymond Rowe, who was 49 at the time and a well-known local disc jockey who often worked under the stage name DJ Freeze. The contrast between the killer's violent past and his public persona as a community DJ was jarring. To confirm the match, investigators placed Rowe under surveillance. They covertly collected a DNA sample from a discarded item of trash he had used, which was then rushed for testing. The DNA retrieved from the discarded item was a perfect, conclusive match to the DNA found at Christie Myrick's apartment in 1992. In June 2018, Raymond Rowe was arrested and charged with the murder of Christie Myrick. The motive was never fully explained, appearing to be a random attack that occurred when Christie was preparing to leave for work. The true motive, however, was overshadowed by the shock that the killer had lived openly in the community for decades, even performing publicly as a DJ. Raymond Rowe later pleaded guilty to the murder and was sentenced to life in prison. The murder of Christie Myrick stands as one of the most significant and early success stories of forensic genetic genealogy. It proved that in the modern era, a person's genetic identity is no longer a secret, and that even the coldest cases can be solved through the voluntary actions of a distant relative.